Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's 35 minutes after the hour. Your calls are welcome right here. 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Emails go to talk@larslarson.com. And we turn now to Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, author most recently of A Battle for the Soul of Islam. Doctor, good to have you back on the show.
It's great to be with you, Lars. Thanks for having me.
I guess I'm almost not quite sure where to start, except for maybe the fact that the White House took a week to admit that it was 9/11 and perhaps the death of al-Qaeda number 2 and the trials coming up for other al-Qaeda accused terrorists that might have inspired those attacks on our embassy and not some obscure film in California.
Yeah, you wonder why America's influence in the world is on the retreat. The president thought in 2009 that his speech in Cairo was going to reboot the relationship. He thought the Iranians were going to unclench their fists. And at the end of the day, we've never been weaker. We've never been more of a pushover, and they're playing us for fools. I mean, I can tell you, as having family from Syria and living there, the riots in the streets now are the predictable rent-a-mobs that are stimulated by some of the thugs in the area that then motivate some of the radicals to start doing what they did, and al-Qaeda often participates in that. Very different from what happened last year, which was movements of millions against dictatorship as a result of concerns over employment, economy, and real moves for freedom. But that was just a convulsion. It's not a spring. There is a power vacuum that happened since last year, and had America been ready with leadership to fill that vacuum, to begin to do so, as we did in Eastern Europe when the Soviet wall fell down, I think we would have seen better changes. But we're basically going to get even a worse boss than the old one, which is, as we saw in Iran in '79, the ascendancy of theocrats that are now the biggest threat in the entire Middle East. We're probably going to see the same thing now in Egypt and Tunisia because of American weakness.
Dr. Jasser, okay, how to phrase this? Is it that the president has nobody on his staff who's telling him this, or that they're telling him this and he's ignoring it because he feels he knows better than the experts around him? I mean, I guess, or it could be a combination of the two, but it seems more likely that it would be either they're telling him all of this and he's ignoring it, or they're not telling him that because, nobody on his staff knows the things that you know and what seems like an average person reading the newspaper would be able to absorb?
Well, I think he doesn't have that many people telling him that, on top of the fact because the way he views the world. I mean, look at the left that he surrounds himself with, the Center for American Progress and others. They view this as a post-American period, that ultimately we're part of a global village. We should apologize for being the cause of everything in the world, and we really don't have ideas that are better. And in many ways, I think, as President Bush called it, it's the soft bigotry of low expectations that somehow the Muslim world must really want theocracy, and who are we to tell them what they should want? And this isn't, the war on terror is over, and they were so busy doing backslaps in the White House that I think they wanted to not say it was terrorism because they're so convinced that the war is over. So, I think many of them are looking through the same lens, which is a fantasy land that doesn't want to see that we're entering Cold War 2.0, that needs advisors that understand that, no, we don't want to declare war on a quarter of the world's population like many of us Muslims, but on the other hand, there's a political aspect to it, a political Islamist movement of the Muslim Brotherhood and others that are the biggest threat to us since the Cold War.
Well, but Dr. Jasser, I mean, there's another debate I'd love to, not a debate, but a discussion I'd love to have with you sometime about what constitutes mainstream Islam, because it sure seems like if these countries, I mean, we've had mobs in our streets too, Occupy, that certainly weren't representative of the mainstream of American thought. And if anybody watching from the outside thought the Occupy crowd was representative of America, it'd be very easy to say it was not. And yet, these kinds of things going on in these other countries with tens of thousands of people, maybe hundreds if you count all 10 of the countries where the major demonstrations were, seem to be, relatively tolerated by the local population and the local governments as though they want it to happen. As you say, President Obama doesn't disagree with this either. So where is the mainstream of Muslim thought? Because a lot of us are very afraid that this whole religion and its base belief that it has to be the dominant religion is simply incompatible with a constitutional form of government that espouses plurality for religious belief and rights for all. That's certainly not what Islam seems to exhibit. If you look at them, they don't believe in. If you look at the way that, say, the Coptic Christians, this filmmaker, I've kind of been defending him, Doc, because I've said, look, if I came out of, if I had been a Coptic Christian in Egypt and managed to get out and was making a movie about Muhammad, based on what I've read about the way the Copts are treated in Egypt, I could imagine making a pretty disparaging movie about the head of a religion that's treated me and everybody like me very badly for several hundred years?
Well, listen, I was with you almost until the very end there. Okay. And at the end, I think, is where you and I disagree in that, every religion, I think, has to prove itself through reform and modernization. And I think we just are putting Islam at its wrong point in history. Muslims are basically where the Christian world was pre-American Revolution, pre-Enlightenment, and they still haven't separated mosque and state. And as long as that religion and state, religion and legal systems like Sharia are mixed in with the personal spiritual practice, you found a theocratic element in the West that, until you had a very violent revolution in Europe, was monopolizing and controlling society and controlling thought. And it took quite a war until the Church of England was marginalized from mainstream thought. And I think similarly, you're right, these aren't just the mobs. The Al-Azhar University 2 days ago, the highest center of Islamic learning, made a statement about these movies and about the West that was viciously anti-Western, conspiratorial, and cannot in any way, they condemn the violence, but you can certainly see that a lot of these ideas that are resulting, some of which in violence and others, is the fact that the leaders of our faith, the imams, the clerics, are like the old theocrats of the 17th and 18th century. There needs to be a revolution of thought. Now, having said that, many of our families came to the West because, and I talk about this in my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, I talk about how we've reformed our faith personally in our homes and in our practice by enjoying and loving America. But now the world is calling on us to have a responsibility to create movements to counter them. And I think indigenous within much of the Arab Spring was these movements. The Brotherhood did not they only got 25% of the vote the first time around in Egypt, but they won the runoff because they're far more organized. And I think with the right tipping points, with the right movement and assistance on the ground, remember, our NGOs were locked up a month and a half ago in Egypt because they were helping some of the good people. And we can't abandon them. If we abandon them, the Russias and the Irans and the Chinas of the world will help the theocrats ascend. And I do think that we have to have some hope. But you're right. If you just look at the loudest and the most powerful, there's very little hope.
Doctor, two other recent developments I wanted to ask you about. One, the White House is said, or the Obama administration is said to be negotiating right now, possibly to return the blind sheikh, Omar Abdul Rahman, to Egypt, which I consider as good as a release of the man who's serving a life sentence here for his terrorist activities. And the second development, the Obama administration, we just found out this afternoon, has bought ads on Pakistani TV to apologize for this American free speech, this movie in California. So how will the rest of the world read that? I know how I read it. I think it's the Obama administration selling out First Amendment free speech and threatening to release a convicted terrorist to Egypt as some kind of goodwill gesture, which, I don't know, maybe releasing a serial killer to an American state would be a goodwill gesture here, but I can't imagine seeing it that way. So how are Muslims going to look at that from the rest of the world? Are we going to be even more the weak horse by doing these things?
Absolutely. It proves that we're a paper tiger. It proves that they are the ones that are allowed to define who America is, that we are always on the defense. And it proves that their grievance culture is what actually dominates rather than engaging in a war of ideas and pushing back against ideology. Because you can't do both. If we legitimize their grievances, that somehow we're putting their heroes in jail and that we're anti-Muslim and anti-Arab and anti-Islam, if we then respond defensively to these grievances, it will never allow us to be advocates in the defense of liberty. So the people on the ground, you remember the Egyptians were throwing tomatoes at Secretary Clinton's car 2 or 3 months ago. because they saw them going and meeting with the Brotherhood, and they said, listen, why are you meeting with these oppressors? We have no respect for them. These are the reformers that were doing that. So they're not going to have very much respect for us. And, at the end of the day, we cannot, if we either can advocate for free speech, there's so many other worse movies. The Egyptian government shows the protocols of the Elders of Zion every year, and the Israelis and the Jews don't demonstrate in the streets and then trash Egyptian embassies, etc., because we're sophisticated, and we should expect the same of Muslim countries rather than have this bigotry of low expectations and being on defense. And we have to advance liberty instead of continuing as this paper tiger responding to grievances, which is what we continue to do with this administration.
Do you think President Obama is buying into this because it helps accomplish his other goal of diminishing American stature in the world as part of his, I guess, world redistribution, not only of economic power, but of military and other power?
I think that's part of it. I think, he's also on an election cycle where he wants to find the shortest point to get him reelected, and fighting an ideological battle where he has to stand up and articulate why a trashy movie should be defended as far as free speech. He doesn't want to make that argument. So it's a lot easier to push it under the carpet and say, well, the war is over and this was just a mob, or, and not really define what we stand for. And I don't think he really necessarily knows, because remember, the reason there's an alliance between the left and the Islamists, even though they don't agree on gay rights, women's rights, and so many things they don't agree in, the reason there's an alliance there is because they look upon society in a collectivist fashion the very same way. They have different missions, but the way they collectivize economics, collectivize the decrease of American nationalism, it's the same whether you're an Islamist in the Brotherhood or you're a leftist in the far left in America. And it's going to be the same narrative. And they both want to minimize American power and stature so that we become a dependency culture.
Doctor, do you mind staying through to the next segment? I don't know what your time restraints are tonight.
Sure.
Okay, very good. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is with me tonight. He's the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. Glad to get your calls at 866-439-5277. Emails go to talk@larslarson.com. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. 8 minutes before the hour, and it's a great pleasure to have on the program Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, author of most recently of A Battle for the Soul of Islam. Doctor, do you mind if I ask you a couple of nuts and bolts questions about both the movie that was made and about the history of Islam and the Prophet Muhammad?
Sure.
All right.
Sure.
Now, I've heard, even in the story today from the AP about the ads bought in Pakistan to apologize for this, which I think is highly inappropriate for the U.S. government to be apologizing for American free speech, whether other people find it vulgar or not. But the AP describes it as a vulgar movie. I sat down over the last, a couple of nights after this whole thing broke, and I said, I'd better watch this thing. And it was a bad piece of video. It wasn't a well-made film. But that's not really the point. The main hits on that seemed to be it portrayed Muhammad as being a womanizer, Muhammad as having had sexual relations with an underage girl, a very young girl, a child, and a lot of these other things. Vulgar or not, or well presented or not, as I understand it, Muslims don't want the Prophet Muhammad depicted in any way. They don't want him pictured. They don't want him drawn. They don't want a photograph made up or a composite. They don't want films made about him. So the very existence of the movie, that's an offense to Muslims, correct?
Yeah, the depiction of the Prophet. Remember, one of the main changes in Islam from Christianity was the lack of a trinity and the sense of monotheism, and the prohibition from Orthodox Muslims of seeing the image was in order to prevent the deification of the Prophet. So it was actually to prevent deification, not to over-worship him, which is actually what these radicals end up doing. And actually there are many Sufi Muslims that have paintings that do depict the Prophet. Even our Supreme Court has on its front little images of people that have contributed to the law of man over history, and there's a depiction of the Prophet on our Supreme Court. So it's sort of a bit of an exaggerated response to what Muslims typically will accept.
But when the film depicts him as a womanizer, take that as you will, I watched enough of it to see that, they depicted him as somebody who appreciated women. And I don't know enough of the history outside of the bits of the Quran that I've read to know whether that's accurate or not. But is it accurate?
No, that's not how I was raised. The Prophet Muhammad is looked upon as Muslims as being the most respectable human being that God chose to relay his message, to retell the stories of Abraham and Moses and Jesus. And we put him at the same level of respect as the prophets of man from the beginning of Adam to Abraham. So, to say that he's a womanizer, that's yes, he was married to Khadijah, and he had up to 4 wives, and was married to, this whole issue of whether, pedophilia is a pathological psychopathology of men that want to have sex with children.
Right.
The fact that he was married to a young girl, we believe as Muslims and mainstream Islam that marriage wasn't consummated till the girl was 17. And, ultimately, I'm not going to apologize for or try to explain the culture at the time, but this was not looked upon as by Muslims that it was in any way psychopathologic, but rather a marriage that actually prevented war at the time between tribes.
Well, I understand that. I guess I'm just saying that if we're going to look at it from a modern perspective, that we have to, that if non-Muslims look at this and say he was with a very young girl, that's something we don't approve of today, whether it was done at one time in history or not. So I guess I'm worried about when free speech begins to be disparaged, the free speech itself, because painful ideas are presented which are controversial. I mean, just this week there was a report, which may or may not be false, that Jesus had a wife. Now, I think it's based on a piece of papyrus that it turns out looks like it's probably phony anyway. But you don't see, Christians rioting in the streets because somebody says, hey, maybe we found something about the historical Jesus that suggests he had a wife.
And that's a perfect example. Is that Muslims from the beginning, at the time of the Prophet, there were pagans and atheists that used to spit on him, used to tell him he was the Antichrist and that he was garbage and all this. And we as Muslims were taught that the Prophet's response was one of either silence or compassion and or debates, but that it was not appropriate to respond with violence or with any type of oppressive behavior or restriction of speech, and that if religion truly is free, this is why our First Amendment has freedom of speech and religion in the same phrase, is because the two are intimately related, and that inherent in being an atheist is believing in the lack of respect towards religion.
Dr. Jasser, I'm up against the clock. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, a battle for the soul of Islam.